From the RSNA, this is the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. My name is Paul Gee, and I'm a radiologist at the University of Maryland and co-host of the podcast.
And my name is Tejani, and I'm a radiology resident at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center and co-host of the podcast. Each month, we dive into the hottest topics in radiology AI and talk with leading experts, thought leaders, and movers and shakers in the field. We sat down with a panel of some of the most exciting researchers in the field of imaging AI to talk about the journey to starting an AI research group. Dr. Andreas Rauschecker is an assistant professor in the Department of Radiology and Biomedical Imaging at the University of California, San Francisco. He is now PI of the Brain Lab at UCSF, which focuses on developing algorithms to analyze and quantify clinical brain MRI in the context of a variety of pathologies. He's an active member of UCSF's Center for Intelligent Imaging and the Baker Computational Health Sciences Institute. Dr. Kirti Magudia is an assistant professor of radiology at Duke University School of Medicine. Her research centers on high-level applications of machine learning in radiology, including CT-based body composition analysis and prostate MR, which was facilitated by 7 dedicated months at the MGH-BWH Center for Clinical Data Science. Dr. Paul Yee is director of the University of Maryland Medical Intelligent Imaging Center, UMI, and assistant professor of radiology at the University of Maryland, and co-host of our podcast. He leads a multidisciplinary research lab evaluating and validating novel machine learning methodologies for medical imaging, along with Dr. Vishwa Parekh, a computer scientist and technical director of the UMI lab. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. I'm your co-host, Tejani, and we have a wonderful group of some superstar clinicians, researchers in the AI field. So it's my pleasure to have Andreas, Kirti, and Paul being our co-hosts for the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast, but serving as a special role as one of our honored guests here. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, and so the topic today is one we hope is helpful for especially our trainees and our young junior attendings starting out in this field, specifically looking for a career in AI research. And so starting a research lab can be daunting, especially with the demands on early career radiologists. And I'm sure each of our guests here have a story and unique experience that led you to your current roles. Now, while we all work in AI, our career paths are slightly different. And before we really get into that and learn more about your journeys, can we start off with just your backgrounds and what got you into informatics and artificial intelligence in general? And then maybe if you could talk about when you decided to formally pursue a career in research. Andreas, if it's okay, we can start with you there.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks again for having us on the podcast. So my journey into radiology, I actually remember the exact moment when I decided to go into radiology rather than neurology, which is what I had been thinking about up until that point. And it was during my PhD. So I had a background in neuroscience, studying the brain using imaging, fMRI, and so forth. I was actually studying the visual system during my PhD. And during that time, it became a very hot topic to study the patterns of activations on fMRI signals in the brain and to try to predict behavior or the stimuli that people saw based on the pattern of activation on fMRI scans. And so this became a really big field, and we got into this as well. And people were starting to use sort of early versions of AI software, machine learning types of algorithms. And so we were using SVMs, and we were finding some really interesting results that if you took sort of the pattern of activation as a whole, that could give you a lot more information than averaging over an area of the brain, let's say. So at that point, I thought I had just done a radiology rotation and saw sort of how subjective everything seemed to be in clinical radiology. And I thought, we have these tools already to be able to more objectively measure things on images and to use these sort of advanced image processing techniques, including machine learning analysis. And I thought this really ought to be applied to clinical radiology. And of course, many people had that thought right around the same time, probably. And this has become a huge field, which is amazing to see. But that's how I got into AI and into radiology.
Wonderful. That's very exciting. And I already have a lot of questions. I'm going to hold on to those. Kirti, would you be able to tell us more about your background and how you got into informatics and AI?
Yeah, thank you. So, similar to Andreas, I did a PhD, and during that time, I was actually studying cancer biology and cell biology. So, I was doing bench research. I was using confocal microscopy. So, I did a lot of microscopy work with immunofluorescence and image analysis. And I think at the end of that, I got pulled into radiology from an excellent mentor, kind of from a women's MD PhD group. So got pulled into radiology. And at that point, I knew already that research was really important to me. And the way that I thought that I was going to connect it was maybe through molecular imaging. So that was kind of at the back of my mind. But I came into residency and I was at Brigham and Women's, and they had just were establishing the Center for Clinical Data Science. And so as I was thinking about the type of research I wanted to do as a resident and as my future, I heard of some of the projects and things that were going on there and found an excellent mentor, Michael Rosenthal, who's at Dana-Farber. And he was working on, kind of lots of projects related to pancreas cancer and GI oncology, which really tied back into my PhD. And one of the things that he was working on was body composition. He had hired a lot of residents to do manual body composition segmentation. And by the time I was a third year resident, they had already trained some models to do this automatically. So I came in and he pulled me into looking at clinical applications of this model, making it high throughput. And it was very exciting because it wasn't just, curating data and training a model, but really, how do we get this closer to implementation and show that this will be useful clinically? And so I think that really felt to me like the type of translational research I wanted to do as a clinician researcher, and has really kind of propagated and motivated me going forward. So that's kind of how I got into it. It was kind of from the side door. But what I learned was that, as the clinician working on AI projects, it's not simply, you know, going to a data scientist and saying, "This is my idea. Will you run with it?" I mean, there, are many, many hours of work that you can do with your clinical knowledge and with some expertise of programming that can really make these projects move much faster and be much more successful. And so I think that's where I've come at it, and I've really enjoyed this time that I've had in this field so far, and hope to continue to do so.
Thank you. That's also wonderful. And I'm already hearing all these amazing pearls. So we're going to come back to those in just a moment. First, Paul, so our listeners know you well, but we'd love to hear more about your story and how you got more involved in the field, specifically moving towards a career in research.
Yeah, sure. It's nice to be on this side of the mic, so to speak. Yeah, well, unlike Andreas and Kirti, I did not do a PhD. In fact, I did not start in radiology. I actually started out as an orthopedic surgery resident. I did my intern year and PGY 2 year. And, I think the TLDR is I didn't really like surgery. To be honest, I didn't like the lifestyle. So I had to do a lot of soul searching. But what I came from that was I liked anatomy. I liked thinking about musculoskeletal problems, and I liked research a lot. So the reason I'm sharing that is I think it really drove and set the foundation for why I would get interested in AI. I had been convinced early on that clinical research really could make a tangible impact on patient care, on patient outcomes from my early experience with diagnosis of infections after hip and knee replacement, which I spent a lot of time in medical school and residency on. But when I switched to radiology, I came in with that mindset. I really like research. I love the mission of it, helping people, and I've seen it actually happen during my career. But I didn't know what I wanted to focus on. I think I was always had a little bit of nervous energy trying to figure out, all right, what am I looking for? What's the problem that I want to spend the next 10, 20, 30 years of my life focusing on? It was the fall of my second year of residency when I was at some random dinner with some mutual friends. There was a guy named Daniel Ting. He's an ophthalmologist who was from Singapore at the time, doing a Fulbright scholarship at Hopkins, where I was doing my residency. And this guy, literally from the moment we sat down till like the moment we got up, he was just talking about AI this, deep learning that. And this was fall of 2017. So still pretty early. And I was sitting there pretty skeptical. I looked at him and said, hey, listen, chest x-rays might seem simple, but there's an art to it. It's so challenging. We have to look at a 3D structure and 2D. We have to look at technique, etc. But I think at the end of that night, he had kind of worn me down to at least be curious. And so I started reading about deep learning, about AI, and it was kind of like, a whole new world was unveiled for me. I just saw, wow, deep learning is what's allowing my photos on my iPhone to be tagged. It's what's allowing for Tesla to develop self-driving cars. And I saw some of the early examples in radiology and in medical imaging at large, including Daniel's work, which little did I know, 4 months later, he would have a first author paper in JAMA, basically looking at diabetic retinopathy. And so, from there, I just saw this incredible opportunity to be involved with a new technology that I thought could be paradigm shifting. And right as it was really getting born. So not even at its infancy, but sort of like its neo-nascency. I kind of looked at it like this is almost like being there when CT was invented or when MRI was invented. But the other exciting piece was I was seeing that a lot of the deep learning frameworks, they were developed by Facebook, so like PyTorch and Google with TensorFlow. Because of how fast things were moving in the fields, I thought this is probably going to push the pace of what usually is a slower process in medicine. Something that might take 20 years might only take 5 years, 4 years to make it from bench to bedside. And so, yeah, I was hooked. I was convinced. I thought this is going to change the field. So I came in it really kind of wearing this physician scientist hat saying, I don't know anything about AI right now, but I'm going to learn as much as I can. But I'm also going to know what my weaknesses are. So one of the first things I did was go knock on the doors over at the engineering school at Hopkins across town and basically found some collaborators who were also interested in applying deep learning to medical imaging. I started a research group with a couple of attendings at Hopkins, one of the engineering faculty, worked with an undergrad who was looking for research for credit, and one thing led to another. And, I started learning more about the field, both from the technical aspects, the clinical aspects. And really, it's just been one thing after another. I know I met you, Ali, through SIM. I got involved with the informatics community at large. I recognized that AI wasn't just going to exist in this vacuum of Python and TensorFlow, but it really needed to be in this larger informatics context. And yeah, it's just been an organic journey from there. The one thing I'll say, kind of piggybacking off of what Kirti was saying, was, I recognize that it's not enough just to know the clinical knowledge, but you really have to be able to meet technical collaborators halfway to kind of speak their language, to be able to say, hey, I have this clinical problem. I believe it's best classified as a classification problem. And this is my preliminary experimental design. Maybe these are some preliminary results, because I think that really lowers the barrier for those technical colleagues to try to understand and also be excited. So it's just one of the things I've picked up along the way. And yeah, it's been a fun journey so far.
I love these origin stories, by the way. I mean, this is it. If our listeners want to stop here, you have a lot to work on already, because you're hearing from some of the greatest in the field about how they made it in informatics and AI and how they're pushing those boundaries. So looking at this, everyone here has contributed significantly to AI literature, and you're leading exemplary labs. And one word that comes to mind after hearing your stories is trailblazing, right? The road was not paved given the new and rapidly evolving nature of imaging AI over the past 5 years. And one commonality here, I think, is that everyone in this conversation really got started as AI was taking off in medical imaging. It's been there in industry, absolutely, but this is part of the group that is helping making it a standard, right? Developing those paradigms, as Paul mentioned, in our field. Thinking about this, and when you think about your journeys, what were some of the most intimidating barriers to pursuing AI research? And then, if possible, talk about things that helped you overcome them. And we can go with Kirti if you have some thoughts here first, or Andreas. Either way, I know we're eager to hear from everyone.
Yeah, I guess I'll just start very briefly. So I studied mechanical engineering as an undergrad at Berkeley. So I had some background in programming, primarily in MATLAB. And so I can't, when I started working in this area, I saw everyone working with Python. I was still kind of working in MATLAB on some things. And there was a big activation barrier to kind of switching over in a way that where I could communicate better with everyone and work better. And so that was a big step, and I got help from lots of different people. One person I'll mention is Walter Wiggins, who's also on faculty here at Duke. We were residents together, so he kind of put together a little startup kit for how to get set up with Python on your computer. And then I went to my technical collaborator, Christopher Bridge, who's still at MGH, And I said to him, look, like, I love working with you. I know you know a lot of things that I don't know. Would you consider taking half an hour out of every week that we're together and just sitting down with me and giving me some pearls of things that you think would be important for me to know that will help me know kind of what to explore? And so he did that for, I would say, a number of weeks, probably at least 15 or 20 meetings. And through that, I really gained so much so fast. So I'm very, very thankful to him for that time that he gave me. And I think it makes me realize that setting aside that amount of time for others can also help them overcome that activation barrier.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. That sort of the community of people has, first of all, been a real highlight of my early career so far, and also has been really helpful in overcoming any kind of barriers to pursuing AI research, because there's just so many smart people who have decided to take this path, and not just smart, but also very generous and just wonderful people. And so that's been a real highlight. I would say, while it is true that the path was not paved for us to start with, that also led to a lot of opportunities to sort of pursue the questions that we were most interested in. I feel like, and that's still true now. It's still very much the early days, right? And people are still trying to figure out what are the key questions to answer, and how do we even go about AI research on a large scale. And so those are all really, really great opportunities. I will say, sort of from a maybe more practical standpoint, I think this is getting a little bit into the transition from trainee to PI of a lab. That's a tough transition. And I think one of the primary reasons that is tough is we're all interested in research and in contributing to the scientific community and to the betterment of clinical practice, but we're not really taught how to be managers of a laboratory in our training, and I think that can be really tough. And so that's something you have to sort of learn from scratch or learn from others. And again, I would point out that I've been very fortunate to be surrounded by a great community of other lab PIs. I've teamed up with one of the other neuroradiologists here at UCSF, Leo Sugru, and we work together, and he's taught me a lot about how to manage a lab. And then, of course, also being surrounded by all the great trainees and other folks who are interested in doing research, who make my job a lot easier. So I would echo what Kirti said about the sort of community of people, mentors and students alike, who make it a lot easier. But I will say it is a significant challenge to learn how to manage a laboratory and be able to be productive in pursuing AI research.
And I'll echo what Andreas and Kirti have said. And on the note about management, I agree. That's been one of the most challenging things. Building a lab is a lot like, in my opinion, building a company. It's building an organization. You can have a culture that naturally develops, or you can be intentional about that. You can be intentional about establishing standardized operating procedures, or you can let it kind of go organically. And I think that there's pros and cons to both, but it's something that I never really thought about until I was probably in fellowship, and I started thinking, okay, I got to build a group, and I better start learning about some of these things. So for me, along with the clinical kind of learning curve as being faculty now, along with the research, I've been doing a lot of self-study and leadership, trying to figure out what does it mean to, one, be a manager, but two, also be a strategist, being a coach, a mentor. And I'll tell you, I used to think these things were, these soft skills, quote unquote, were kind of, well, soft. I'm recognizing why there are things like MBA programs, why there are things like leadership programs. But I would say from a practical standpoint, one of the most intimidating barriers for me initially starting AI research was just looking at the materials that were available and realizing that a lot of it wasn't necessarily written for me. I mean, I was a physician. I wasn't studying computer science. So the things I would read would either be too high level and just kind of not detailed enough for someone who is intending to pursue research, applying deep learning and AI to medical imaging, or it would be way too in the nitty gritty, in the weeds about math and things that really didn't have much to do with what I wanted to do. And so I think that was a challenge, just distilling out all of the materials available. And I think over time I figured out some good resources, but that was really intimidating at first, just trying to delve through all of that.
If only there was a Rosetta Stone for that sort of venture, right? And so you mentioned soft skills, Paul, and I think that's so key, right? Things that we just don't learn in residency, especially if you decided later that you want to go into research. Maybe it becomes an interest in fellowship, like you mentioned. And I hadn't thought about MBA programs and formal leadership programs, but I can see the value in those and really learning from the mentors there. And so what I think this sets up beautifully is talking more about those mentors in our life. And Paul, you and I have talked about the importance of having role models and mentors guiding us early in our careers. So for our group here, who are some of your mentors and how did they influence your paths? I know we've touched on it just a little bit, but is there one particular moment that stands out where maybe things wouldn't be where they are today without that mentor and their guidance?
So, Ali, that's a really good question. I've got to acknowledge that I've had a lot of really great mentors over the years through my journey in radiology and imaging informatics. But the single most influential mentor for me was during my time in orthopedics. In between my third and fourth year of medical school, I did a gap year at Rush University Medical Center where I spent a research fellowship with Craig Della Valle. He's a hip and knee replacement surgeon who's really changed the field of how so many things are done for complex hip and knee replacement surgeries. Everything from diagnosis and treatment of infections to something called adverse local tissue reactions to metal debris in the setting of catastrophic failures of these implants. And for me, the reason why he's the most influential person was he taught me not just the hard skills about how to do research, which he certainly did. I learned the nuts to bolts of how to manage multiple projects, whether it's industrial funded post-market surveillance studies, multi-center randomized controlled trials, retrospective studies, prospective observational studies, to how to write papers, how to analyze data. But he really taught me how to dream big about big questions, really hard questions to answer that would have real tangible impacts on patients. The biggest case in point is infection after hip and knee replacement. It's kind of one of those topics. When I first heard about it, I wasn't so thrilled. I was like, kind of gross. How important is it? But I realized that it's actually not as uncommon as you might think, and it's devastating for patients. And it was something that I think people didn't really have good quantitative data on. How to diagnose it, what are the thresholds for diagnosis based on synovial fluid cell counts, and so on and so forth. And one of the hard parts was that it was hard to collect data. And so this person just spent 10 years of his life just doggedly day in, day out, collecting data, standardizing protocols, to the point where someone like myself could come in, really take advantage of that, and answer some really important clinical questions in a tangible way. And what was really exciting about that is I saw that the impact of our work was used clinically. Literally that same year, after we published that paper, I would be on my orthopedic rotations. We would be using that diagnostic criteria. And so for me, it really showed me that the goal of clinical research and advancing patient care wasn't just this pie in the sky thing. It was real. You could do it, but it would take a lot of hard work. But as long as you had passion for it, you had a vision, and you had a plan, it was something you could achieve. And so that really set the tone for the rest of my career, entering into orthopedics, transitioning to radiology. I think it gave me a lot of confidence in my abilities to be a self-starter. I saw with what Craig had built, and I said, well, if he can do it, I can do it too. Because I recognize, he's a really smart guy. Don't get me wrong. But I think that, he was a really smart person who just worked really hard and really intentionally. And so that was something that, I had never really seen before. And so I think beyond the hard skills of research, really that kind of vision, that kind of work ethic was just tremendous for me.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I have also been very fortunate to have a lot of wonderful mentors throughout my training and my early career. And I guess I'll just highlight one person in particular who I think not a day goes by with me thinking about how this person would do things in running a lab or in doing science in general. And that's my PhD mentor, Brian Wandell. He was an absolutely huge influence on how I currently think about science and how to run a lab. In fact, I'm not sure exactly how I would have done it without his influence. As I said, not a day goes by without me thinking, well, what would Brian do in this situation? he was already very senior by the time I joined his lab and had a lot of leadership positions, but still found the time somehow to sit down with next to me, and we were coding things together. We would write things together, and how he found the time to do all those things, I'm still trying to figure out. But nevertheless, I try to live up to how he ran his lab. Even more importantly, I think to me, is how he thinks about science and how to be really rigorous in your science. And that's something we need to be really careful of in the AI field, because it's very easy to make mistakes in AI if you're not sort of grounded in the principles of science, splitting your training, validation, and test cohorts, and picking the right question in the first place, and all these sort of fundamental principles of science, then you can make mistakes. And I saw an early version of that in my own work when we were starting to use machine learning techniques to analyze fMRI data. We were getting really great results, and it seemed like there was all kinds of interesting information in the pattern of fMRI data that we were looking at. And then Brian said to me, well, let's do a negative control experiment here. Let's take a part of the brain where we don't expect this information to be there at all, and let's run our machine learning model on that part of the brain. And lo and behold, it seemed like there was still information in that part of the brain, which was completely unexpected. At that point, you might have concluded, well, maybe this part of the brain does actually have the information to encode position sensitivity, which is what we were studying about stimuli. But of course, it turned out that no, there was just a data leak in our data. And essentially, there was a leak between the training and the test data set. And we wouldn't have found that unless we sort of stuck to these core principles of positive controls, negative controls. And it can get really complicated in the AI field to adhere to those principles, and always being skeptical of your own results, making sure that you fully understand the data and the way that you've analyzed the data in every single way is something that, one of the things that Brian really taught me. And I will say the other thing that very much relates to the AI field as it currently stands that he taught me is explainable AI. So we, built a model that was able to encode some information that we were really interested in based on the fMRI data. But, we didn't stop there. So Brian said, well, can we figure out how the model is making its decision? Can we map the features back onto the brain to see sort of where things are encoded? And so we went down a whole path about that. And so he was already thinking about explainable AI, back then. And so really thinking deeply about the problem is something that he instilled in me. One last thing I'll mention is another thing that Brian Wendell taught me, which is that he would often say, yeah, the most difficult thing in science is not sort of the technical aspects and this and that, but it's how do you frame the question appropriately? And I think that's also something that we really need to keep in mind in AI. We have this amazing tool to do really cool things and study interesting questions, but which question do we choose to study with those tools is something that takes a lot of thinking, takes a lot of time, and sort of a lot of introspection. What are the most pressing questions in the field that we can use AI to answer? So yeah, I've had the fortune of having many wonderful mentors across the years, both on the research side and the clinical side. But my PhD mentor certainly stands out among those.
All right. I'm so excited to talk about this question as well. I agree. And one of the things that kind of strikes me from both Paul and Andreas's answers is the idea of like this mentoring network. So I feel like truly I have many mentors in all domains, and some I go to occasionally and some I talk to more often. But there are definitely some commonalities and responses. So, for example, the person that I was choosing to talk about was my PhD mentor as well. Again, not in the AI space, but an incredibly successful scientist, who really understood both the scientific aspects and the management aspects of running a lab. And so from him, what I learned was how to effectively kind of manage all the different people in the lab, kind of keep them on task, manage resource allocation, which I think is really important kind of when you're thinking about AI and computational resources, storage resources, because you can very easily come up against limits. Even if you don't think that they're coming quickly, they will hit you and hold you in place for longer than you would like. And I think also just thinking, this idea of asking the right questions and the solid foundation in science, I don't think that that can be emphasized enough, because we have these great tools, but it really does take a long time to get from the beginning to the end of any of these projects, even if they're AI and you think that, oh, it'll be easy, I'll just get some chest x-rays and run this model on it. I mean, if you're at the end of the day, it's going to take much longer than you think. So asking that right question, thinking about how to disseminate that information at the end, all of those are really important. And I think what my PhD experience taught me with my mentor, whose name is Alan Hall, was that not to be afraid of failure, that not all projects are going to work out, regardless of how much time and effort and intention you put into them, even if the question was something that was very carefully chosen. So the first project I worked on during my PhD was to look for a certain factor, a certain protein that we thought was going to really interestingly impact the morphology of yeast with relation to their cell cycles. I did this yeast to hybrid approach, not very relevant to exactly what we're talking about today, but at the end of the day, I put 2 years into that project and it didn't really go anywhere, but turned around, started something new, and through figuring things out, ended up with a really nice finish to my PhD. And just in a couple of words, since I know that we're not talking about cell and cancer biology here, was able to show that mutant KRAS, affected cell morphology, and then that really impacted the integrity of the epithelium and kind of led to early stages of colon cancer. So I think at the end of the day, you can really get somewhere. You have to be patient, you have to be careful, and know that not all of the projects are going to work out. And I think that that has been important for me to remember as I start in this AI field, because I think that as you start exploring and going deeper and deeper into this work, it's almost another PhD experience, whether you've already had one or, you're learning kind of as you're going in the early career timeframe, or as a fellow or as a resident. So I think those were the important pieces that I took away from that particular mentor.
Thank you all so much. The wonderful things I think that stands out here is that each of you has been paying it back in a mentor role now as well. And I imagine a big part of that is actually drawing upon your own experiences and your own mentor-mentee relationships. And so thinking about, if you will, mentoring our audience for a moment here, because I know we have up-and-coming AI researchers, very talented trainees and attending physicians and members beyond even the radiology space who are listening for advice to guide themselves in this field. Hindsight 2020, right? What would you have done differently if there's anything? Is there any advice that you have for our listeners in this context? And it can be about anything that you think would be valuable, right? I know it's a broad question, but hopefully you can pinpoint that single advice that can help our listeners avoid the same, whether it be a mistake or just a hurdle in their own endeavors. And so, Paul, let's start with you and we'll move down our group here.
Yeah, sure. So I think if I could do things again, and again, recognize that hindsight is 2020, I think I would have tried really hard to think, and to the extent possible at that time, what was my end goal? Like at the end of my residency, end of my fellowship, what kind of job would I have wanted to have? And I say that because I think that what it does is it allows you to be focused and really working backwards to say, what are the steps I need to get there? For me, naturally, I kind of find myself interested in a whole bunch of stuff. And so I think there's a temptation a lot. You see it on Twitter, all these PhDs and research faculty, whether it's in medicine or, sciences. It's like a project that you should be finishing. And then there's all the other projects out there that seem much more attractive, like the new project. And so I think that there's a little bit of that for me, where I think I found myself unfocused a lot. But I'll say the caveat of that is that I do think that there's some merit to exploring, to kind of trying out different things, because things organically change, right? But I think that for me, I could have benefited from a little bit more of reining it in and trying to focus. I was trying to figure out what my interests were, and where I was going. I wasn't totally sure. I always think I had some idea, and I probably could have been a little bit more focused. So, maybe a practical way of implementing that, at least starting out, I would say taking one project from start to finish, experimenting, writing it up and trying to get it published. That is probably a good practice before juggling, let's say, 2 or 3 projects or even 4. I think that if you start out juggling too much at once, you may not have the bandwidth or the skill set to really see all of those through. And so you may actually end up being able to get a lot more accomplished if you focus on one, then maybe take on two, and then maybe add another one, as opposed to trying to do too much at once. And so I say that recognizing that a lot of us in medicine and radiology, we got to where we are because we are kind of type A and overachievers. But that's something that, if I could go back, I would probably try to focus a little more and recognize that if I spend a little time slower in the beginning, that probably would have paid bigger dividends in the intermediate and long term.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. And I should say, I think this is a really hard question, actually, because I'm still trying to figure it out. I don't know the best way of going about things, and it probably varies for different people and depending on your goals and the type of person you are and so forth. But I will say that one of the things I've learned along the way is how important focus is. Focus down, narrow down. We're all trying to improve the way that radiology is practiced and improve the outcomes in patients and so forth. But starting with something small is probably better, and taking that all the way from start to finish, as Paul said, and then you can expand from there. The other thing I would add to that is, and I think this is actually really challenging, is find something you're really passionate about, a question that you're really passionate about. And the reason I say it's challenging is because you often don't know until you sort of get into the details of it, if you're really that passionate about it. As both Kirti and Paul have said, it's often a long process to take things from start to finish. And so you have to be passionate about it to be able to do a rigorous job on it and to be able to finish it in a manner that you're happy with in the end. And then, from sort of the PI perspective now, I think the other reason it's important to find something you're really passionate about is that, again, I sort of said this before, but you can easily get lost in the tools of AI, which are really cool and really fun to work with. But ultimately, that's not what most of us are focused on in the end, right? We don't want to just build better tools for the sake of building better tools. We want to build tools that solve an important problem or do something useful in clinical radiology or in research radiology. And so the guiding light should be that goal at the end there, not the tool in and of itself. And so as a PI, that becomes really important because funding is inherently tied to the question that you're studying, not to the tool building. The tool is an important means to answer an important question, but the funding is tied to the question itself. And are you working on an important, interesting question? And so taking your time to think about what that question is that you're passionate about, that is important in the field, I would really emphasize spending time and energy on that piece.
I appreciate those pearls and definitely agree with all that both of you have said. I would say that my piece is recommending that our listeners really focus on finding the right collaborators and nourishing those relationships. And I know that those have both been mentioned, multiple times during this podcast so far, but I can't emphasize that enough. You cannot work in a bubble by yourself in this space. It is very, very difficult. And it's, if you can find those right collaborators and nourish those relationships and really kind of build something that works for both of you or for an entire network of individuals, it will be so much easier to get from point A to point B. And I think that's part of what's helped me. It is a challenge. I think it's a challenge for everyone to find those right people, and those right people are, in demand by lots of folks, and can also move institutions or go to industry. So I think, really thinking about that and working well with those individuals, I think is really helpful. As someone starting out as a junior faculty member, I think this idea of recruiting has been kind of a really important theme. I know that we've talked about this offline between us before, but I think it's incredibly challenging. You have to be very, very intentional. And even then, I think it's difficult to be successful. So just kind of keep in mind that this is a challenge, but that you can find the right people. And when you find them, try to keep them as happy as you can.
This is so valuable, and sometimes starting out early myself here, even just learning about what's out there, you feel like you're a kid in a candy shop or like an early innovator in an AI marketplace, right? You can just grab at AI, segmentation tools for the adrenal glands. You can grab at NLP, or you can go into AI monitoring, ethics, and bio. I mean, there's so much. And so the idea of really taking a deep breath, stepping back, And going back to that clinical problem, right? What is it that we're trying to do to fix patients? I mean, that just resonates heavily. And hopefully that's the same for our listeners here. So to wrap our conversation, I think there are a couple of things that stand out, right? Intellectual curiosity, determination, and passion. I think with those three aspects, our listeners should be ready to go into this foray and really join this group of wonderful researchers and clinicians translating all this exciting, innovative work to help improve patient care and patient outcomes. I will say that, as you mentioned, the AI community is one of the warmest that I've personally found as well. And hopefully, speaking for everyone here, if you're listening to this, talk to us, reach out, learn more about what our guests are doing. Tell us about what you're doing. And as Kirti was saying, you can't work alone in this bubble. It's hard to do that without coming into contact with someone else. So hopefully looking forward to collaborations going forward. Before we finish, are there any final thoughts? Any parting words?
I have to say that I love what Paul mentioned very early in the conversation, which was that we hope that this will be paradigm shifting, similar to when, CT was invented. And I think that is so exciting. And we're really lucky in radiology that every, incremental advancement that's happened in radiology really does affect the entire rest of medicine and, and healthcare as a whole. So I think that is our hope, and we're all working towards that in a way that we think will be clinically useful and able to be implemented.
I really agree. It's just a wonderful time to be in radiology and using these amazing tools to study health and disease using imaging with the tools of AI and data science I feel very fortunate to be able to be doing that on a daily basis.
I guess I'll just say on the record, because I think this conversation has been rejuvenated in the Twitter space. I think AI is one of the most exciting reasons to enter the field of radiology for any medical students or even undergrads thinking about medical school. It's funny how many undergrads I meet now who, after I talk to about AI, they think, I wasn't even thinking about med school. I didn't even think these two things could actually jive together. But I just think it's a really exciting time, just as Andreas and Kirti said, to be a radiologist.
Thanks for joining us for this episode. We hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Check out the latest articles from our panelists and their labs at the Radiology Artificial Intelligence website. Thanks to all our panelists involved in the conversation and for sharing their expert insights.
We hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Radiology Artificial Intelligence Podcast. Shout out to Uriah Shemchison for our podcast music and to the RSNA podcast staff.
Email us at podcasts@rsna.org anytime with questions, feedback, or suggestions.